In the 1840s, the United States kept pushing west. New land came under American control, and the map looked bigger every year. But the country did not feel connected. A letter or a piece of news still took weeks, sometimes months, to cross the continent. People travelled by wagon, by river, or by ship around South America. Every option cost time, money, and lives. The distance was not just inconvenient. It was dangerous and politically risky. Settlers heading west faced breakdowns, sickness, and stretches with little help. Businesses could not move goods fast enough to build reliable markets. The federal government could not easily send troops or supplies to distant territories. The farther Americans spread, the more fragile control became. Expansion created a new problem: how to hold the country together. That problem fed an idea that started to sound less like fantasy and more like necessity. A railroad that ran from the established East to the Pacific would cut travel from months to days. It would move mail, soldiers, and products on a schedule the nation could count on. It would also decide who benefited from the West and who got pushed aside. In the 1840s, the obsession formed: build a line that bound the coasts. In the early 1850s, the idea of a railroad to the Pacific stopped being just talk and started becoming a federal question. Congress authorized official surveys to find workable routes across thousands of miles. That sounded straightforward, but it never stayed technical for long. The moment the government agreed to measure the land, it also agreed to choose winners and losers. A line on a map meant power, money, and influence. Rival cities pushed hard to pull the route toward themselves because a railroad stop promised growth and a future. Politicians joined the fight, not just to solve a transportation problem, but to shape the country's next center of gravity. Every possible path carried a different set of benefits. Put the tracks through one region and trade flowed there. Put them through another, and you built up a new political base. So the surveys became more than measurements of mountains and deserts. They became ammunition. Reports, maps, and recommendations got used in speeches and votes as each side tried to prove its route was the only practical one. What looked like a neutral fact-finding effort turned into a nationwide argument over where the nation invested its future. The dream did not disappear. It hardened into a contested plan. By 1862, the Civil War changed the math in Washington. The Southern lawmakers who once blocked a transcontinental railroad were absent, and Congress moved fast. That year, it passed the Pacific Railway Act. It did not just praise the idea of rails to the Pacific, it ordered them into existence. The railroad stopped being a wish and became a national decision. The law picked a structure that forced progress. Two companies were created and pushed toward each other across the continent. Union Pacific built west from the Missouri River. Central Pacific built east from California. Each mile of track became a measurable goal, and the country treated those miles like war work, urgent, strategic, and tied to the nation's future. Most important, the act attached money and land to the promise. The federal government offered land grants along the route, giving the companies property they could sell later. It also backed the project with government bonds, real cash support that lenders trusted. This was policy with teeth. Public power now stood behind private builders, and the race could begin. In 1863, the plans stopped being paper promises and turned into crews on the ground. In Sacramento, the Central Pacific began pushing east. Near the Missouri River, the Union Pacific started driving west. Both companies learned the same lesson fast. Starting lines on a map did not mean men, tools, and food appeared on command. The railroad needed builders, not speeches, and there were not enough of them. Skilled railroad labourers stayed scarce, and the Civil War kept pulling able-bodied men away. Every missing worker slowed everything behind him: grading, bridges, ties, rails. Supplies posed another choke point. Iron had to be bought, shipped and hauled. Timber had to be cut and moved. Even basic items, spikes, rope, blasting powder, had to arrive in the right place at the right time. Too often they did not. Getting anything to the work sites became its own job. Wagons broke, animals failed, routes turned to mud or dust, and distance punished every mistake. When transport lagged, crews waited. When crews waited, costs rose. So the companies pushed harder, stretching men and materials to keep the grade moving forward. This was the turning point. The railroad became a daily grind of muscle, logistics and deadlines, not a law. In 1864, the Central Pacific ran straight into the Sierra Nevada, and the easy miles ended. The grade steepened, the rock hardened, and winter did not just slow work, it erased it. The company needed hands fast, and it needed men who stayed, so it turned to Chinese immigrants already in California. And then it recruited more by the thousands. That decision changed everything on the Western line. Chinese crews took on the jobs nobody could make progress on: cutting shelves into granite, hauling earth and timber, and driving tunnels through solid mountain. They worked with black powder, then nitroglycerin, with mistakes that killed in an instant. Snowstorms buried camps and blocked supplies, and avalanches swept men away without warning. Yet the work kept moving day after day because the workforce did not disappear when conditions turned deadly. By 1865 and 1866, the railroad's fate in the West rested on that labour. When snow piled higher than a man, crews built snow sheds and cleared track just to keep construction alive. When cliffs stopped the line, they bored through them yard by yard until the tunnels opened. Management measured progress in feet, but the real achievement was endurance. Immigrant labour, especially Chinese labour, became the force that pushed the Central Pacific through the mountains. In 1865, the Union Pacific pushed out of the Missouri River Valley and aimed straight across the plains. The workforce came fast. Irish immigrants looking for wages, and Civil War veterans used to hardship and danger. Crews threw down track at a pace that surprised even the managers. But speed came with a price. Heavy timbers shifted, blasts misfired, and men died in routine accidents. Progress moved west, one risky mile at a time. The plains did not cooperate. Summer heat baked the graders, winter winds froze equipment in place, and sudden storms stranded supply trains. Camps had to leapfrog forward, always hungry for water, wood, and food. Every delay mattered because the company earned more land and federal support by laying more track. That incentive drove the work harder and faster. It also pushed the railroad deeper into territory where native nations already lived, hunted, and travelled. As rails advanced, the consequences turned violent. Surveyors, woodcutters, and hunting parties cut into the resources that sustained indigenous communities, and the line brought soldiers, forts, and steady traffic behind it. Attacks on work crews and trains met armed retaliation, and the fighting spread along the route. The railroad did not simply cross the plains, it changed what control of the plains meant. In 1865 to 1867, building track became a tool of displacement and war. By 1867, the work turned into a straight race. Miles of track meant speed, and speed meant money. The federal deal rewarded companies for every mile finished, paying with government bonds and enormous land grants. That system pushed the railroads to build fast, but it also encouraged a dangerous habit: treating the railroad like a machine for turning public support into private profit. The financing grew complicated on purpose. Investors wanted guarantees, executives wanted control, and contractors wanted inflated bills. On the Union Pacific side, insiders created a separate construction company called Crédit Mobilier. The same men who ran the railroad also profited from building it, charging the railroad high prices and then paying themselves. The track advanced and the costs ballooned. As rumors spread, the story stopped sounding like national progress and started sounding like a scheme. Critics asked why taxpayers funded bonds while private insiders collected dividends, and why land meant for development became bargaining chips. Investigations followed, and Crédit Mobilier became a public scandal that showed the hidden math behind the rails. The railroad still moved forward, but trust in its funding collapsed. By 1869, the race ended in a specific place. Promontory Summit, Utah. The Central Pacific Line pushed east, the Union Pacific Line pushed west, and at last the gaps disappeared. When the final rail joined, it did more than finish a job. It proved the continent could be crossed by steel, not by wagon trails and rivers. A single connection now linked two oceans. The joining became a public event, staged for the country to hear about immediately. The Golden Spike ceremony turned a construction project into a national message of victory and unity. News travelled fast, and the moment sounded bigger than the raw work behind it. But the spotlight landed on executives and officials, not the crews who swung hammers and set ties. Many builders stayed invisible. Once the tracks met, travel time collapsed. Trips that had taken months by wagon or ship now took days by rail, with fewer handoffs and far less uncertainty. That changed decisions fast, where people moved, where businesses shipped, where money flowed. The railroad did not just shorten distance on a map, it made the continent feel smaller in the American mind all at once. In the decades after 1869, the railroad stopped being a one-time triumph and started acting like a daily utility. Trains ran on schedules, and that demanded a shared clock. Rail companies imposed standardized time zones, so stations, shippers, and passengers stopped arguing over local noon. It sounded simple, but it changed how Americans organized work and travel. The West no longer lived by scattered local time. It moved to railroad time. As service spread in the 1870s and 1880s, tracks created instant towns and just as quickly abandoned them. A depot meant paychecks, warehouses, saloons, and land deals. It also meant migration on a scale wagons could not match. Families arrived with tools and furniture, not just dreams. Cattle moved from open range to distant packing houses, and minerals moved from mountain camps to eastern markets. The railroad linked producers to buyers, and it pulled everyone into cash economies. That link came with a hard price. Faster settlement pressed into native homelands, and the railroad's demand for land, timber, and water accelerated dispossession already underway. Bison herds shrank as hunting and habitat loss followed the rails, and grazing and mining reshaped whole watersheds. By the 1890s, the railroad no longer worked like a single line on a map. It operated like an economic system, deciding where labor went, what goods mattered, and which places thrived or disappeared. By the present day, the first transcontinental route no longer worked as one clean, unbroken line. Pieces of it got replaced by straighter tracks, heavier rails, and better grades built for modern trains. Other stretches fell quiet, left behind when new routes offered faster and cheaper shipping. What once looked like a single, heroic project turned into a patchwork. The railroad still mattered, but it mattered in different ways, depending on where you stood. Some parts still carried freight, not as a symbol, but as a working tool that fed ports, warehouses, and inland factories. The railroad kept doing its basic job, moving heavy things farther than roads could, for less money. Yet the meaning shifted. People no longer talked only about speed and progress. They also asked who benefited, who got pushed aside, and who paid the price. The same tracks that promised unity also carried the record of conflict and exclusion. That change showed up in what Americans chose to remember. Museums, memorials, and new research treated the builders as central, not as background, especially immigrant laborers who once got ignored in the celebration. The story widened to include displacement, dangerous work, and the long aftermath of expansion. The railroad stayed infrastructure, but it also became a reckoning. The old 1840s promise of a bound-together nation met the modern need to face consequences out loud.